Hi, my name is Marko and I'm a sound therapist. I'm glad that Sardul invited me to this special event of the Global Listening Center, and I'll try to share a little bit about listening. Working professionally in the field of sound led me to certain conclusion about listening. But first, I would like to start with the main definition. According to the Merriam-Webster dictionary, listening is: first, to pay attention to a sound. For instance, listening to music or listening to a conversation. This would be our regular way of communication and of interacting one with each other. 2. To hear something with thoughtful attention or by giving consideration. Example, listening to a request. In this way, or in this case, it seems that we are listening a little bit more in depth, because obviously we will be urged to reply and to take action possibly on something that's being said. Definition number 3. To be alert to catch an unexpected sound. Example, listening to the step of somebody. In this case, we are more focused on hearing something and we are paying specific alertness to this event that will then determine our future actions. Now, first of all, we need to understand that listening, it's a multisensory experience. It's an experience that involves the acoustic part that we obviously hear through our ears and is then processed by our brain, and the tactile part, which is often perceived by our skin, so sound, vibration, interacting with our physical body. An interesting fact is that biologically we cannot switch off listening. We can switch off the eyes, we can switch off the smell, we can switch off even breathing for a while, but we cannot switch off our ears. And this possibly means something. In other words, even if we use earplugs or if we clog our ears with our fingers, we will be still perceiving a certain amount of this specific sense that will be coming through us. Now, sound often change our mood, and this is something that is very much known. For instance, a specific type of music can make you feel in a certain way. Some music can uplift you, that's usually the party music or dance music, and some music can put you in a more melancholic state or in a very specific meditative state perhaps. Listening is often also seen as centering or focusing to something. So when we want to, for instance, understand better a subject, we often, if it's recorded, re-listen to then reprocess, and our level of focus is in this case perhaps even bigger than it was in real time. Listening is also very important when we are connecting to ourselves. For instance, listening to silence. Silence is something that is nowadays a rarity, because it's almost impossible to be 100% in silence unless perhaps at 3 a.m. and even at that time it's not entirely sure that this will be. Now, we should listen more and appreciate all sounds in all forms. Often we identified something as noise, and then because it's noise, either it's true noise like noise of traffic, or noise what we consider in terms of communication. Now, this noise of communication, it's something that we will not really get into, but definitely noise is something that is very subjective, because some of us are already so used to be in noise that we often cannot even detect it, because it's literally in our background, and the brain, in a certain way, they are not processing this any longer, which does not mean that we are not exposed to it and that it's not in a certain way even harmful. I would like to share with you now a poem of who is considered to be, I believe, the father of American poetry, Walt Whitman. Now I will do nothing but listen. I hear all sounds running together, combined, fused, or following. Sounds of the city and sounds out of the city. Sounds of the day and night. Since we are already in this, let's say, poetic state, I will now go to somebody that is certainly known to many of you who are more in the spiritual domain. I'm talking about Krishnamurti. So he also have a very interesting speech in Ohio in 1966, where he addressed what he thinks true listening is. Now I'll be reading this because obviously the quote is a little long. When we hear, we either accept or reject, or we translate what we hear according to our knowledge, to our background, or we compare what is being said to what is being already known, or we oppose one idea by another. All of these characteristics of hearing denies the act of listening. I would like now to stop for a moment here and discuss a little bit. So, according to him, and not only him, the moment we are not 100% focused, I trust that the best word to use in this case would be present. So, the moment we are not 100% present, we are prevented to fully listen. When one listens, there is no comparison. There is no acceptance or rejection. That very active listening brings about a total attempt in which you see the totality and the whole significance and structure of what is being said. Well, that's very important because obviously if we do not compare, the biggest problem nowadays is the mind. The mind always wants to compare or to find what is good, what is bad, try to find not only labels but give some kind of judgments and definitions. And this, in a certain way, certainly prevent the true message or the true act of listening. The quality of listening is attention. And when you attend totally with your whole mind, with the heart, with your nerves, your eyes, ears completely, and intensely listen, and you give your whole attention to something, this is when you completely listen. In that state of attention, there is the act of listening. In other words, when we get over our mind, and when we stop listening with the intention to reply, then we are listening. And that act of listening puts away anything that is not true. You listen to the totality of the thing. When you attend, there is no borders of inattention. And that act of listening, it's really a miracle, perhaps the greatest one. When we can listen totally without any defense, without any barrier, then one can look and then one can listen. Krishnamurti then continue. If I want to understand what you are saying, I must listen to you. I must listen to you with affection, with care, with attention. I'm going to find out what you are saying. But if I say, I agree with you, I've heard this before, or you're saying something to me which is not true, you are not listening. In other words, we need to eliminate all judgment, all assumptions or predispositions, all belief structures or prejudice, and most of all expectations. Then we can truly listen. The question is, can we? Disregard what you consider to be right and wrong, and then you can truly listen. Do not prepare to reply. Truly listen. Unlearn what you have learned, and then, and only then, you can truly listen. This was now a summary of one of the teachings of Krishnamurti. I must say I'm very much inspired in the way that he put all together in what is listening. Now, if we try to go further and find a definition, what is listening, because this is what we are interested into, listening is attending to reality or attending reality. In other words, it's not something that we project and we already expect how things will be, and we try to prepare in what to say back, so it becomes a sort of acting, because this is very often what listening is. We are going to have a chit-chat and we already know what should be our favorable outcome. Well, this is not truly listening. Now we need to understand that also listening is a form of obedience. For instance, for a child to listen to the parents is an act of being obedient, because obviously if the child is not listening to the parents, most likely the parents will in one way or another punish the child, at least after a while. Now, one advice could be, let's be quick to listen and slow to speak. I would go even further and say that according to one proverb, I forgot from where, we have one mouth and two ears. In other words, we should listen twice and speak just once. And that's for sure for a reason, because just in this way, not only we would listen better, but we would most likely see things in a different way. Now we need to understand as well that there is a frame reference of what is listening. And if we are listening to our voice, our inner voice, or if we are listening to somebody else. Another quote that I also like to put here to further this debate is by Simon Sinek. Hearing is listening to what is said. Listening is hearing what isn't said. Quite deep one. Most people don't listen with the intention to understand. They listen with the intent to reply. This is by Stephen Covey. One very important part is also listening to ourselves. According to Plato, he defines listening in 4 different ways. Number 1, the aim of listening, the nature of listening, the role of a listener, and the relation between the listener and the speaker. All of these 4 are interconnected. The role of a speaker is to prepare the listener to listen what he/she has to say. The role of the listener is to show the speaker what needs to be said in order for the listener to attend. And from here, most likely, if we define, listening is attending to reality. One very important factor is what are our expectations. Now, in an article from 2015, where scientists were investigating the auditory processing in an effort to better understand whether the expectation of sound affect how and what we hear, they came to a very interesting conclusion. These two scientists, Emily Bogler and Andrea Roop, come to the conclusion that sound, in 80%, it's not coming as an external stimulus, what we are assuming, but what we expect to hear is almost so important to sound that it takes this 80%. Quite astonishing, right? The assumption is backed up by the fact that hundreds of milliseconds for sound to be processed along the nervous system to the brain are needed, which does not explain how we can immediately recognize the sex of a speaker or identity or a melody just after a few milliseconds. So the researchers are now trying to understand how sound is processed and possibly come to new treatments for the auditory processing disorders that can be potentially done in the future. Now, there are a few interesting statistical facts that we can also consider a little bit. Some of them are funny, but let's go through them. So, number one, we forget 50% of what we hear immediately. This is quite amazing, but yeah, I'm certainly not a person that has a very long time span of attention, and also the memory as the years are increasing is decreasing in this case. We forget 90% of what we hear within 24 hours. Very good to know. Listening is an active, not a passive process, and this is something that we should definitely consider while we are listening. Listening is a skill which should not be confused with hearing, because hearing is a physical process. Number 5. Listening is the most important element in an effective conversation. I think we all agree with that. Number 6. Good listeners have lower divorce rate than poor listeners. I don't know, but I assume that if you are a good listener, perhaps you are taking action faster, so perhaps you're preserving the possible relationship or you're maintaining the relationship in a better shape than if you're not listening. Number 7. Good listeners have better memory skills than poor listeners. Well, can be. I don't really think that, I never seen anything that would scientifically back that, but yeah. Number 8. Pets often listen better than people do. Well, I think this is quite true, because when we are outside or outdoor, we can clearly sense that animals can sense something that we cannot. Number 9. We listen with the twin goals of receiving and retaining the substance of speech. I think this is the ambition, but then it's not necessarily what happens. Number 10. We think 4 to 5 times faster as we speak. That potentially can be the truth. Number 11. Good conversationalists listen far more than they talk. Maybe because they are tired of talking. Number 12. Listening includes awareness of both verbal and non-verbal communication. That's for sure, and this is already something that we were discussing, that also effective listening is a key element to effective interpersonal communication. And the number 14, as the last one, all of these factors, considering also the attitude, has the greatest effect on good listening. Now I would like to spend some time about critical listening. When I was in my recording studio that I built 17 years ago, I often remained until very late, because the operational hours were from 10 to 10, but then we ended up like at 3-4 a.m. and so on. So then I was tired, sometimes I even fall asleep. But the interesting part is that sometimes I just wanted the silence, and the studio environment was super silent, particularly the control room is super silent. So when I switch off all the equipment with all the transformers stopping buzzing, I was really able to hear this inner nerve system, so this like very high pitch one in the head, and then at the same time also a sort of noise that started happening in the ears that presumably is the cardiovascular system. Now, critical listening is different because with critical listening we want to be an active listener, so not a passive one but an active one. But first let's define what is critical listening. So critical listening, first of all, it's not appropriate for each situation. For instance, if you want to just give me an information about when are we meeting, obviously it's critical to listen to the timings and perhaps even location. So in this case, this is obviously very important. But sometimes we have also other ways of listening. So for instance, appreciative listening. So when we are listening something not with intention to reply, but with the intention of pure enjoyment, and this would be listening to music. In other words, this would be something that we are doing out of pleasure, such as listening to the song that we like, or to a conversation, or to something that we also enjoy. The second one is the empathic listening, when a person listens to another and it's showing concern. So let's say that the listener understands the struggle of the other person and try to connect in a certain way, in an emotional way. So in this case, obviously, we are listening critically to a certain extent because we don't want to start judging and aggravating already the situation that is not in best shape anyway. So yeah. Last one is the comprehensive listening. This is when a listener is trying to understand a particular message and often includes note-taking. So basically we need to kind of reply to something and to pay attention to details, because then we will have to obviously reply back. Now, when a person is critically listening to another, they are checking for authenticity in the message. The listener will assess this information that the speaker is conveying and decide whether the accuracy of the message is good or not. Then the listener will also be able to form an opinion that either agrees or disagrees with what is being presented. Now, for conclusion, I would just like to add that listening is something that we do automatically, although often we are not really listening. We are, again, expecting that something will be said and then we will have to reply. And in the moment that we are processing what we'll have to say back, this clearly shows that we are not listening because we are preparing ourselves. Now, somebody can be a smart ass and say, yes, I'm multitasking and I listen and at the same time also form my reply. Well, I'm not entirely sure this is possible, but even if it is, it's again a sort of non-presence, because if we want to be present and really and fully understand and listen, also because a lot of communication through listening comes from non-verbal communication, which is something that we should not neglect. Often happens that a person is saying something and you can clearly see that she or he it's not really meaning that, or that they are hesitating to say something and so on. And this can clearly give you a lot of additional information that you will never be able to get just from the conversation that you have with this person by means of vocal communication or by word exchange. So listening to music in this aspect is a little bit diverse, Because when we are listening to music, we are usually listening to what we like or to a specific type of genre that we identify with. But again, identification, whether we like to hear it or not, is part of the ego. So in other words, when we are listening to something, we are then trying to identify with what we are listening. I know for myself that often I get very big satisfaction out of listening of tiny fragments of a song, usually instrumental ones, because I have my personal, let's say, fetish on rather listening instrumental songs than songs with the voice. Also because I think that often the lyrics actually interfere with what is the message of music itself. Now, listening in music is it also depends on how it's done, because for instance, when I was studying audio engineering, we also have critical listening, and this involves that we listen to a lot of different styles of music, different genres, and try to assess their production. So how they, for instance, recorded the drum set, how the bass was recorded, what type of synthesizers were used. And then after this, obviously, when you put all of this technical assessment on side, comes the artistical expression to try to identify whether the song has authenticity, or it's a copy or something, or is a sort of like cheesy song that is kind of done on the latest trends that are kind of postulated in order to make it a smash hit. And then at the end of listening, also how is mastered, in other words, how it's mixed, and how is then processed at the end. So what is the ratio between certain frequency ranges, how good you can hear the depth of the instruments, and how much can you immerse yourself into. So listening to music in this aspect is not that much different. It just involves, let's say, even more layers of comparison compared to the listening that we have in a communication with a person or in a group. So in that case, it means that the more we are also into music, the more we will be critical. In other words, the more we will be judging. And this is a limitation. That's also why when I give sound therapy trainings, I need to point out always in chapter 11 of the training that there is a very big difference between sound and music, because music will activate the mind, and the moment the mind is active, we cannot really access our full potential, or we cannot really access this altered state of consciousness in where we can find ourselves. So music has also limitations, as obviously communication itself. So to summarize all together, I think that for listening, it's very important that we try to not take position, which sometimes it's obviously very hard because we need to defend our cause or a reason, that we try to give ourselves and the other participant the time to explain, but at the same time also tract as much as possible information, and based upon that then decide what we do next. I think that also, as many things in life, even the art of listening is often rewarded, because who listen very well will hear beyond what is just being said. And by saying that, I really like to thank again Sardul for inviting me to this special event, and hopefully we see each other on some other occasion again. Thank you.